So this morning's first speaker is Hanno Böck, speaking on the burden of faulty TLS implementations. If you want to read up on Hanno, you can look at the app and it'll have his bio, but I'll just leave it there and we'll hand it straight over if you can give him a warm welcome.
Hello. Okay, you can hear me. Can you switch on the beamer? Yeah, great. Okay, I'm going to talk about TLS today and about an issue that I think is not very well known but causes a lot of trouble, and that is that a lot of the TLS implementations out there are just bad. They have severe bugs that sometimes even cause issues not only for themselves but also for the whole ecosystem. And I'll try to convince you in this talk that we have a problem there. And so a quick introduction what I do. For once, I work as a freelance journalist. Unfortunately, most of it is in German, so most of you probably can't read it. But I regularly write for a German webpage called Golem, which is an IT news webpage, and also for some newspapers, and occasionally for LWN, which is in English. That's better for you. And I also try to find security vulnerabilities and bugs in free software applications and do that mostly with fuzzing. And I get funded for that by the Linux Foundation's Core Infrastructure Initiative. But that's not what I'm going to talk today. And I write a monthly newsletter about TLS, which is the Bulletproof TLS newsletter, which you all should subscribe to. I think today or tomorrow we will send out the next one. Okay. TLS, a quick thing to get out of the way. There's this thing with, okay, it's SSL or TLS, and in the end it's just SSL is the old name, TLS is the new name. That's it. So SSL was developed by Netscape in the 1990s. There was a version 2 and a version 3. Version 1 was never published, so it doesn't exist in the public record. And then it was taken over by the IETF and renamed, and they started the versioning again, which causes a lot of confusions, but that's how it is. And we have TLS 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2. And 1.3 will come out sometime soon. And the colors here indicate, so SSL2 and SSL3 are really broken. Like, disable them, don't use them for anything. TLS 1.0 and 1.1 are kind of problematic. So there are attacks that can be prevented, but it's really hard to prevent them. And TLS 1.2 is really the only version that's still reasonable to use today. Okay, we had a number of attacks in the past years. So it started with Beast, Crime, Breach, many more. So the interesting thing here is that in the past, let's say 5 years, a lot more research has happened on TLS. Which is generally a good thing. So I would argue that today we understand much better what's secure, what's problematic, how to design these protocols in a more robust way, and what issues can happen. And of course, also, this is the time where, okay, a good vulnerability today needs a name and ideally also a logo. Else it's not severe. So if we look at these attacks, then something interesting comes up, and that is that many of them have a history that many years before the attack was already kind of described, but it was like a theoretical attack, and then 5 years later, 10 years later, someone comes up and says, okay, we can attack this in practice. And I think this really tells us something, and that's that we're not learning from mistakes. So if a cryptographer comes and says, here's a weakness, then we should listen to them, and we should probably not wait until another cryptographer comes and says, I can really attack this. We should fix it before the real attack happens. And I was really surprised, like I stole kind of this idea for the slide from someone else who had a similar slide, but he had only 3 examples, and I thought I can come up with more examples, and I was surprised how many examples there were. So a very typical thing that we have a research paper from the 1990s or the early 2000s, and then someone comes up and says, okay, I've tried this attack on TLS, and I can attack TLS with it. Deprecation. So when we find out that something in TLS, a crypto algorithm, is no longer safe or a version, then okay, we try to deprecate it. And that's hard because we have many people out there that are using old browsers, old devices, or we have old servers that don't support these newer technologies. And I want to give you a few examples. So Drown attack was earlier this year, and it was against SSL version 2. Now SSL version 2 is from the 90s, and we know since, I think, 1996 that it's insecure. We have, since 2011, we have a standard that's saying you must disable SSL version 2. Now, it turned out, still Drown, a third of the web servers in the internet are vulnerable to Drown, which is a vulnerability in a protocol from the 1990s for which we knew like for more than 10 years that it's insecure. So that's kind of the state we are in when it comes to TLS. Logjam. Logjam was an issue in the Diffie-Hellman key exchange where they analyzed how if you have a too short Diffie-Hellman group that can cause attacks, and they provided some optimizations of attacks. And in reaction to that, Chrome disabled these short Diffie-Hellman key exchanges. And that caused a lot of uproar. So if you look up this thread in the Chrome forum online, it has like 300 posts, and people were really angry at Google that they were disabling these insecure encryption methods. So you have here someone saying, this error is preventing me from opening the login page on my Cisco RV042G router. Someone else, do I have to dump Chrome? I need to get to my router and can't. There's no way to update SSL on the routers. Okay, maybe that's a bad thing. This is ridiculous. We had to use Internet Explorer. That sounds really bad. And the one below, I hope you can read that. That's interesting. Someone had trouble surfing to Google with Chrome. So what's going on here? That looks strange. What's probably happening here is, that there are these security appliances and security software that does something which I think is a very bad idea, but it's very common, that they basically do a man-in-the-middle attack on HTTPS connections to analyze the traffic and install a local cert in the browser. And it's especially bad if they do it with a really outdated TLS implementation. So we could have known that, like in 1999, a 412-bit RSA key was broken. Now, you have to know for that the security of Diffie-Hellman and RSA is more or less the same. So if RSA with 512-bit is broken, then Diffie-Hellman with 512-bit is also broken. In 2010, 768-bit was broken. And I think in 2001, there was already a warning that 1024-bit could be broken by a powerful attacker. And this Cisco router we read about 2 slides earlier was released in 2012. So I think this is bad. So in 2012, a device gets released which has crypto on it, from which we clearly know that it's not secure. So more examples for this. In 2010, Nokia, which I think no longer exists by now, I don't know, released the Lumia 800 phone, which had an email client only supporting SSL version 3. Remember SSL version 3 from the 90s, old Netscape thing, and the successor of it was released in 1999. And then Poodle came along. The Poodle attack was against SSL version 3, and then many email providers said, okay, we will disable this old protocol. And people having this phone, which was a really expensive phone, no longer could access their email. And Microsoft said, oh, this Windows Mobile version is no longer supported. We won't do anything about it. There was a very similar case with the AVM Fritzbox router, which had an option to fetch emails for you and had basically the same issue. And the surprising thing is this is happening again. So we already know that TLS 1.0 and 1.1 are not really as secure as we would like them to be, and we probably want to deprecate them at some point. I would like to deprecate them today. But we still have software, like new software, that only supports TLS 1.0. And one prominent example is Apple Mail. So yeah, why is this happening? So today we're in a situation where vendors of devices, of sometimes really expensive devices, seem to think it's acceptable to deliver substandard TLS crypto to you. And I think this needs to change. TLS implementation bugs. This is a bug report for Mozilla I opened in 2008. And what was happening there is sometimes, and especially when I was using my mobile internet connection, I got a wrong certificate from my own web page. And why is this happening? So you have to know for this, if you have the original SSL protocol had the idea that you have one certificate for one IP address. Now, if you have shared hosting where you have multiple hosts on one server and you don't have that many IP addresses because IPs are scarce these days, this doesn't work, and then an extension was developed called SNI, which allows multiple certificates on one IP, which is a good thing. Now, this extension only works in TLS 1.0, and that's where the problem was. So TLS handshake works roughly like this. So a client, maybe a browser, connects to the server and says, dear server, I want to connect with the TLS version between this and that. And then the server chooses the highest one it supports and says, OK, let's connect with this. So if we have a new TLS version, like a browser implements TLS 1.2, which is the latest today, then he can still connect with servers which only support an older version because the server can signal to the client, OK, no, I don't support this new version. I want to do a connection with this older version. But there are servers that don't do this correctly. So what quite often happens is the client says, yeah, I support between this and that version. And then the server says, OK, what's that version? I never heard of that. This didn't even exist when I was developed. So I don't answer, or I send an error. This is called version intolerance. And this is always a bug. So this is not standard conformant behavior. If you have a server like this, the server is broken. But the browser vendors, yeah, and also there's a strange variation of this where you try it with TLS 1.2, and the server then wants to downgrade to SSL version 3. And if you try it with TLS 1.0, the server will happily connect with TLS 1.0, which is kind of weird. Now, browsers learned about this, and there were just too many servers with this broken behavior to fix them all, and then they implemented a workaround. So what a browser does, it first connects with the highest version it supports, then it tries again with one lower version, then it tries again with one lower version. This has been called a protocol dance in the Poodle paper, I think. OK, then many years later, in 2014, so this bug was still open, and I still had a problem with my server, but the Mozilla developers didn't want to fix it because they said we need this strange behavior. At Black Hat 2014, Antoine de Lenat-Lavaux presents the virtual host confusion attack. And now, suddenly, these downgrades become a security issue, which seems kind of obvious, because if you retry to connect with older and older versions, then an attacker can trigger that, because an attacker can just say, OK, if the first connection attempt block, second block, third block, and then he has this older SSL version, that maybe there's a vulnerability in it. And that's exactly what happened there. There was an attack that required SSL version 3, and you could downgrade as an attacker to this older version. Then Poodle was essentially the same. Poodle was a vulnerability in SSL version 3. And you would say, OK, SSL version 3 from 1996, we don't care if that's vulnerable. But if you have these downgrades, then an attacker can force your browser to use this older version and the attack works again. Solution for that was some people came up with a new standard where a server can tell a browser, hello browser, I'm not broken. If you did this strange downgrade, then don't connect to me. That's called SCSV. So we have to appreciate what happened here. So we have a working mechanism to negotiate TLS versions. And servers implemented wrong, have broken TLS implementations. Then the browsers implement a workaround. Then it turns out this workaround is a security problem. And instead of disabling the workaround, they produce another workaround for the workaround to make it not being a security problem. I doubt that that's the right approach, but that's the world we live in. But by now, browsers did something different. They really removed these insecure downgrades, and SCSV is not that relevant anymore. But we can be pretty sure, and this was posted by Adam Langley yesterday, almost like he knew what I want to talk about, where he said, yeah, it's taken about 15 years to get to the point where web browsers don't have to work around broken version negotiation. And when we try to add a fourth, TLS 1.3, in the next year, we'll have to add back the workaround, no doubt. So although all this stuff happened, we're still in a situation where a developer of the major browser these days says, we will probably have to do this all over again. Now, this is not the only example for something like this. Something quite similar happened. It turned out that load balancers from company F5 had a problem with if you did a handshake bigger than 256 bytes. Now, new features were added to TLS, and at some point the handshake got bigger than that. And then on the TLS mailing list, employee from F5 came and said, yeah, but if the handshake is bigger than 512 bytes, then it works again. OK, so what we can do, we can just blow up our handshake, which was done. They introduced an extension, the padding extension, which does nothing else than just add additional bytes to the handshake. So we have another extension that's just there to work around broken servers. Now, maybe you can guess what happened next. What happened next was, there are also implementations that don't work if you have a handshake bigger than 512 bytes. From Cisco, IronPort email devices. Now, the good thing about this is these F5 devices are used for web, and these devices are used for email. So you can kind of, if you do a web connection, you use this extension. If you do an email connection, you don't use it. And then things maybe mostly work. There are other implementation issues that are by itself security issues. And there are a number of things a TLS implementation has to check so that the things are secure, like the padding, like the authentication, and like the finished message. Now, you could create a TLS implementation that omits all those checks. It will still connect, because you don't know if the other side of the connection has really checked the stuff you sent that's all correct. And by now, you shouldn't be surprised by that. There was Poodle TLS. Now, Poodle, we had Poodle earlier. Poodle attack relies on the fact that SSL version 3 has a padding where you can add whatever bytes you want. And that was somehow exploited for a padding oracle. And this attack was no longer possible with TLS 1.0 because there it's clearly defined what bytes need to be in the padding. But you have to check that, else the attack is possible again. And of course, there are implementations out there that don't check it. And so there was a variant of Poodle that also works on TLS. Also Adam Langley's work. Then a developer from the Vivaldi browser found out that for some servers, some checks for this Poodle vulnerability said it's vulnerable, and other checks said it's not vulnerable. And what is going on here? It turned out that there are implementations that check the padding, but maybe only half of the bytes, or only the first byte, or only the last byte, or if it's all 0, they are also okay, although that's invalid. So there were a number of such implementations, and depending how you do the check, it would turn out to be vulnerable or not. The same thing was true in GNU TLS, that I analyzed that, and actually that was a bit funny. I found this bug, and then I talked to someone about it who said, I read about this before in the Lucky 13 paper, and then I looked it up in the Lucky 13 paper, and actually really it was described, this bug, but it said that the check is off by 1, where it actually was off by 2. So they fixed it from being off by 2 to just being off by 1, so 1 byte was still not checked. And then the whole thing was reworked, so it only affects older versions of GNU TLS, but that was interesting how these bugs can happen. And yeah. The MAC. Now, the MAC is a basic mechanism to protect the authenticity of TLS messages, which is an important thing. So TLS is not only about encryption, it's also about authenticity, which essentially means nobody can change what you're sending. So this is important because even if an attacker cannot read your message, if he can modify it, then he can use it for like cross-site scripting or things like that. And there were a couple of server implementations that just didn't check the MAC at all. Affected F5, Cisco, Fortinet. You may see a pattern that some of these companies turn up quite often on these slides. And there's a thing called the finished message, which is protecting the whole handshake. So after server and client have initiated a connection, they do a check of a hash of all the previous handshake messages, which prevents that an attacker can like, exchange messages in between. And there were also implementations that didn't check that. Was the same guy who found this Poodle only some bytes checking issue. RSA CRT. CRT stands for Chinese Remainder Theorem, and there's a way to use this theorem to speed up RSA signatures. And the way this is done is that so an RSA key is basically a product of 2 primes. And if you have these 2 primes, which you have if you have the private key, you can use them to calculate, to do 2 smaller calculations instead of 1 big calculation, which is faster. But it is dangerous, because if one of these calculations goes wrong and you produce a signature, this signature is of course wrong, but it also means the attacker who sees this signature can calculate your private key, which was described somewhere, I think, in 1996 by Ian Lenstra. And then last year, Florian Weimer from Red Hat said, okay, what happens if I just do many connections to servers and check their signatures, and maybe sometimes there's a wrong signature with this error. And he actually found quite a number of devices that had this exact bug, which is another example for like 1996, this bug was described, and it was also described how you can prevent it from happening. And in 2015, vulnerable devices were found. Yeah, and then one of these minor things that pop up every now and then was recently described on, I think, a Mozilla mailing list, that there are servers, if you have an extension that has no length, so it's maybe just enabling some feature, and you put this at the end, then the server doesn't allow a connection. What was mentioned was IBM Web Server Application Server. So now the TLS implementations try to order the extension in a way that the last extension is never an empty one. GCM nonsense, this is a paper I published with a couple of people about a week ago. So the GCM algorithm, that's basically the modern way of doing TLS, because all the other crypto algorithms have turned out to be insecure in some way or another. So GCM is the state-of-the-art symmetric encryption we use in TLS today. And it needs a nonce value. A nonce stands for number used once. So yeah, it needs to be a number. It doesn't have to be secret. It just needs to be unique. So you should never use the same nonce with the same key twice. And the TLS Nana, that's an example for a bad specification, because it doesn't tell you how to do this. It just says here you have to choose a nonce, 8 bytes, and a perfectly sane way to do this is to use a counter. So first use 0, then use 1, then use 2. That's all fine. But nobody tells you that. You have to figure out yourself. No surprise, some implementations get it wrong. We found a couple of servers that use directly duplicate nonces, which is then totally broken, that then you can inject code into a web page. And we found devices using a random nonce, which is, you can argue about it, how risky that is, but if you do a lot of encryptions with that, then you get to a point where there's a probability that nonces will be repeated. And I have a little demo for that. Because one of the affected web pages was from Visa, the credit card company. I wrote them in January to their security contact address. I never got a reply. If anyone knows anyone at Visa, they can contact me. I will explain the issue to them. So I'm surfing to the web page of an attacker. And so on the right side is our victim. On the left side is the attacker running some tool. And it doesn't work 100% reliably. But I wonder if my internet access is not working. No. Okay, now we have the demo effect. It was working earlier today. But I have a video of it, which should be just as good. So we're surfing to an attacker web page, and we get a message from Visa DK with our JavaScript code. So we can successfully inject JavaScript into their web page. If you look at the OpenSSL documentation, you see that these workarounds for bugs, that has been a problem for a long time. So there are many options in OpenSSL where you can enable a workaround for a bug. Most of them are undocumented, so yeah, they are there, you can enable them, nobody tells you why or why not. And there are also many in the code, if you look them up, they are now disabled, so they were having this workaround at some point in the past and then figured out, okay, there are probably no more of these broken devices. But this has been an issue like since we use SSL. Mathematics. So cryptography is based on mathematics. And now, okay, we usually assume that we do something like a multiplication, that the result is correct. And all our security assumptions are based on the fact that the result is correct. Like we heard earlier, there was this RSA issue. If you have a calculation with the wrong result, then the attacker can learn your key. So what happens if our math functions produce wrong results? And there was a bug in OpenSSL early last year, which I found quite interesting, that OpenSSL has a function for squaring. So you just take a number by the power of 2. And it produced wrong results in some very rare cases. And it only produced wrong results in 1 out of 2 to the power of 128. So really rare, and there's no way to hit these cases by chance. So you either have to analyze the source code or do something different smart. It turned out that fuzzing is a very effective way to find these bugs. So it was possible to find this bug with a fuzzing tool. And then I looked deeper into it and found various such bugs in various TLS implementations. So there was a bug in OpenSSL in the mod X, which is essentially the function for RSA and Diffie-Hellman. nobody has figured out whether that's exploitable or not, but it is concerning if the RSA function is producing wrong results. Same thing in NSS for other inputs, but same function that produces some wrong results. Then in the nettle library, which is used by GNU TLS, there were some bugs in the elliptic curve calculations. And quite recently in OpenSSL, there were several bugs in the poly 1305 authenticator. Usually these are carry propagation bugs. So if you do a calculation in a large number, you may know that from school when you added two numbers, if it's bigger than 10, you have to add a 1 to the next column. It turns out that these situations, quite often you get that wrong, and these bugs are relatively common. These were all found with American Fuzzy Lob. And what I was doing there, so all of them were found by me, that I used fuzzing to generate inputs for these functions, and then I compared two different implementations. So if OpenSSL does an exponentiation and libgcrypt does an exponentiation, and the result is different, then something is wrong, because an exponentiation has a clear, unique, correct result. A problem with this is I don't see how you could test this remotely. So so if I only have access to a device over a network, or even if I have access to the device itself, but I don't have the source code, then I don't see a way to find these kinds of bugs easily. Yeah, and this is a bit the conclusion of all these things. I would say almost every imaginable TLS implementation flaw can be found in the wild. This is also, if you are doing security research, I would recommend, if you want to write a cool paper about TLS, just look how TLS works and then think, okay, can this go wrong? And how can it go wrong? And what happens then? And can we check for this? Then you do an internet-wide scan for this, and then you will probably find some implementations that get it wrong. So what can we do about this? Testing. What's a bit unfortunate is that I think we don't have good test tools for TLS implementations. There are a number of tools, but all of them are not really satisfying. So what I would like to have is that I say, here's my server. Dear test tool, just test the server for all these TLS issues. And then give me a summary and tell me if there's anything that's not compliant with the standard that's weird. Unfortunately, there's no tool that's covering all the issues that I described here. And not even, like some of them you cannot test remotely, but most of them can be tested easily. And there's no conclusive tool for that. And that's really something I would like to have. And some of them are going in the right direction, but like, for example, Scapy, SSL, TLS, and TLS fuzzer, they say, okay, the problem is doing these tests with a normal SSL implementation is difficult. For example, OpenSSL doesn't support sending invalid packages. And that's what you want to do when you test for these bugs. So they have their own implementations, but I think TLS fuzzer doesn't support elliptic curves, so it's lacking a lot of features. And Scapy, SSL, TLS didn't support GCM last time I checked. Yeah, it's getting better, but I think we really should have such a tool. As I said, we don't have a thorough TLS test suite. And also, negative tests are important. So we don't only want to know if we can connect, but we also want to know if we do something wrong, then it sends the correct error and things like that. Because it feels like some people are developing TLS in a way, okay, as soon as it connects, we're done. Identifying devices. So when we wrote this GCM paper, what was really a problem was, okay, I knew there are these 180 servers that are vulnerable to this issue, but which product is this? Like, I know, okay, Visa's web page, but what are they using? I don't know. And there I'd say, so there's a header in the HTTP standard for if you have a load balancer or something, that should add this header so that you can debug which device was actually responsible for doing this TLS connection. But nobody is using it because people say, okay, we don't want to show an attacker what device we're using, but you're also not showing it the security researcher. And I think this is bad. I think we should be more transparent about what we're using there. I assume this is a controversial opinion, but if you're a device manufacturer and a security researcher finds a bug in your product, you want that security researcher to be able to contact you. So conclusions, old attacks are coming back and we don't learn from mistakes. Implementation bugs produce security risks, and they also produce security risks not only for the people using these devices, but sometimes also for the ecosystem at large. Please avoid re-implementing TLS if you're not up to it. I don't understand why so many people put their own TLS stack in their devices. I mean, I know OpenSSL has problems, but OpenSSL is much better than most of the implementations you will come up yourself. And vendors ship substandard TLS stacks, and I don't think this is acceptable. Tell this to Apple. And we need better testing tools. Yeah. Thanks for listening, and if you have questions, yeah.
Yeah, we've got 4 questions here. Starting off, if we could put the questions up on the screen. So when can we expect to see TLS 1.3 become widely available for use? Your slide mentioned sometime soon.
Okay, so I don't know what the exact plan of the IETF is. There's a lot of work going on right now, but I expect once it's a standard, it will be pretty fast, at least because the browsers are really much faster on these days than they were earlier. So Google is heavily involved in specifying the standard, and I expect that Chrome will probably ship TLS 1.3 a couple of weeks after it's standardized. And I expect it to be standardized this year.
How can we encourage browser TLS client vendors to stand their ground and not write workarounds forcing vendors with broken implementations to fix their product, or at least feel some heat from users?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I wrote angry blog posts about it, but that doesn't help. I mean, the problem is that if browsers don't do these workarounds, they get the blame. As you saw earlier, the thread on Chrome. So I mean, one thing we can do is, if there are less broken implementations, then we need fewer workarounds. So if you're buying a device, make sure that you talk to the vendor and say, hey, is this really standard conformed? And if it's not, will you provide an update? But I mean, if we had such a test tool, then we could say, okay, before I want to buy a device, I run this test tool on it. But it's a tricky question, and yeah. I can kind of understand the browser vendors, although I disagree.
Would you say that protocol implementation errors are an equal risk with weak cipher suites? Example, servers offering TLS 1.2 but still accepting export ciphers?
Yeah, that heavily depends on the exact situation. So TLS 1.2 accepting export ciphers is a bug because the specification says you should not do that. How severe such an implementation flaw is depends on the circumstances, so there's no general answer on this, I think.
And lastly, did you instrument both SSL implementations when testing for the carry propagation bugs?
Yes.
Okay. That brings us, was anyone on other
If you have more questions, I will be at the AusCERT booth during the break. So yeah, talk to me, and I'm also available via email. And I will share the slides later, so if you want to look it up.
If everyone can give Hanno a thank you.